So guys, welcome back to another video, and this is another basketball reaction, and this is another JxmyHighroller video, and the video is using numbers to find out the most difficult NBA championship ever won. I assume this is going to sort of touch upon the Lakers versus the Heat, and it's probably going to compare them to previous NBA championships, and like, I'm guessing there has been times where the competition's been a lot harder or a lot easier, and it's just people like to sort of make them sort of comparisons. It's just how people in sports are. But I mean, although this may be a bit of a touchy subject, whenever a team win a championship, no matter the circumstances, I still think it's the same thing. Like, at the end of the day, you've got the ring or you haven't got the ring, and even if you've had an easier run, which to be fair, I feel like the Lakers have had some tough matchups, but it's just one of those things that some fans like to use against sort of certain players or certain teams. And yeah, it's just how sport is though. But give us a watch and see, because again, at the end of the day, in the grand scheme it doesn't really matter, but it is still fun to see sort of eras where maybe players had a harder run to the finals, to the NBA championships, to win their rings. But let's just check this out and see like sort of what his point is in this video, and let's just check this out, man.
This long and grueling season with a championship, a storybook ending for LeBron, AD, and the Lakers organization. And now that the season is over, I wanted to
seem so quiet. Back with the audio issues. Let's go.
Take a deep dive into something that has been circulating over the last few days. This championship being one of the easiest to win in recent years.
Is that like an argument that's being made?
Not only did I crunch the numbers to find out if there was any truth to this claim, the result that I got is one you have to see to believe. With LeBron claiming his fourth ring, the tone among NBA fans hasn't changed much. Some people love to see it, others don't. This was about as predictable as it gets. Hence, the title.
I want to read that. I couldn't see that. Back then we used to celebrate three-peats. Now kids are just out here celebrating 4 titles and 10 tries and calling it greatness, for God's sake. And that's just sour meme.
The title of my last video.
Great
many
video,
NBA fans saying this season was so different and unconventional that this particular championship should have an asterisk next to it. Or, as some call it, the Mickey Mouse Rec League Championship.
What?
But looking at this from an objective point of view, where does this championship run rank all time in terms of difficulty? What championship team had the hardest run to a title, and which championship team had the easiest run? Well, I started this search for the ultimate championship run and quickly came across this Reddit post from 4 years ago. This Reddit user came up with a simple way of measuring the difficulty of a team's title run by using an advanced stat called the Simple Rating System, or SRS. This stat measures a team's margin of victory throughout the season adjusted for strength of schedule.
Okay.
Basically, this stat quantifies how good a team is. For example, this season the Bucks had the highest SRS in the entire league of 9.41,
more than
followed
the Lakers.
by the Clippers, Lakers, and Raptors.
Yo.
Just like any other stat, it has its flaws, but overall it's a great indicator of how great or terrible a team is. He then added up the total SRS values for every team that each championship team beat in the playoffs. For example, in 2017, the Warriors beat the Blazers, Jazz, Spurs, and Cavaliers. Add up the SRS scores for each of those teams, and the difficulty of the Warriors' 2017 championship run is 13.77.
I see.
So now that we understand how this all works, here's the list of championship runs ranked in terms of difficulty.
Okay, I just want to try and find the Lakers. Okay, so the Lakers is, what ranking is that? 35th, which is actually kind of wild. And the Rockets, 1995, 23.96.
With the 1995 Rockets having the most difficult path to a
that is an
championship,
interesting
and
one,
the
though,
1987 Lakers having the easiest path to a championship. This list only includes championships dating back to the 1984 season, since that is when the 16-team playoff system was introduced. So, with the last 37 championship teams listed, where do the 2020 Lakers land?
35th.
All the way down at 35th. In the last 37 seasons, only 2 championship teams faced easier competition than the Lakers faced in this season's playoffs. In my last video, I talked about how the Lakers' path to a title this season was no easier than any other championship teams. And I literally could not have been more wrong. Not only was their path easy, it was nearly the
I like how he sort of admitted that he's going to come back to it, though. That's a good thing for him to do.
path of the last 37 seasons. But let's take a deeper look into some of these numbers. The first thing that jumped out at me was that the Shaq and Kobe Lakers three-peat featured 3 of the top 5 most difficult paths to a championship.
That's insane.
That is unbelievable. And even crazier is that in 2001, the Lakers nearly swept the playoffs, going 15-1 while facing the second most difficult opponents in the process.
Jesus.
So if you've ever wondered what team was the most dominant in the last 35 seasons, I think there is your answer.
That's incredible.
Now, if we highlight each decade, then we can see which 10-year span featured the most difficult runs to a championship. And for the most part, each decade had similar levels of difficulty, except the 80s. But this was because for most of the 80s, the league only had 23 teams, which meant a 16-team playoff format featured many teams with losing records.
That's a fair.
Simply put, the league was still good, but it was super top-heavy with bad teams making the playoffs. With that being said, it's still shocking just how easy it was to get deep into the playoffs in the 80s.
That's kind of crazy.
So, you know how the NBA has been a bit one-sided throughout recent history in terms of talent level in each conference? Well, this next graphic highlights just that. When graphing the most difficult paths to a championship using SRS scores on the y-axis, you can see that the West has won 4 of the 5 toughest championships since 1984. The West has also won 12 of the 20 most difficult titles in the last 37 seasons.
Is the West just notoriously sort of, I don't want to say better, but like more competitive than the East? Like, you look at this and it is kind of crazy how sort of lopsided it is for the West compared to the East. But is that a thing that is just seen as that the West is just a bit more competitive, or is this just sort of an unfair sort of view to look at it? Because at the end of the day, there's obviously been some incredible teams from the East and some of the best teams from the East, so it's just a sort of comparison that maybe this just isn't the fairest stat in that sort of area. But looking at this, it's kind of mind-blowing seeing this.
4 of those 8 titles from the East coming at the hands of Michael Jordan and the Bulls.
Yeah.
Here are Michael Jordan's 6 titles. Here are Kobe's 5 championships, every single one of them having a very high degree of difficulty.
That's
and here are LeBron's 4 championships. Now, strictly considering how challenging each of these championship runs were, which collection of championships looks more impressive?
Yeah, that's
At face
true.
value, Kobe's rings are easily the greatest collection of tough titles in the modern NBA. Now consider the fact that Mike and LeBron received Finals MVP in every one of their championship seasons, and Kobe won the award just 2 out of 5 times. And for some more reference, here are Magic Johnson's last 3 championships.
Jeez.
I've said it before and I cannot stress this enough. Not every championship is built the same. And when you start considering other variables like who did they play with, was there any significant injuries, and how well did they play in the finals, you begin to see just how ridiculous it is to base the foundation of your GOAT debate on purely how many rings a player has. Most would agree that 5 rings beats 4. But what if the 5 rings were won on a relatively easy path, while the 4 were won on a more difficult path? And before we move on, I just want to point out that this era of the NBA, the 90s and early 2000s, was easily the most competitive time in basketball.
That's ridiculous.
Just something to think about. So after seeing just how different each title run can be, one surprising aspect of this experiment that jumped out at me was the fact that the best 2 teams don't always end up in the finals. In fact, rarely do the best 2 teams end up in the finals. For example, in the 2001 playoffs, the Lakers faced off against the 76ers in the finals. This was possibly the biggest finals mismatch in recent history.
Oh, for real.
But NBA fans knew this at the time. However, just how big of a mismatch this was is absurd. On their path to the finals, the Lakers beat the Blazers, the Kings, and the Spurs. All of these teams had a higher SRS score than the 76ers.
Jeez.
Of course, this is a rather simple
They
metric
reached
to
the
grade how
finals.
good a team is, but it is not a stretch to say that the Lakers faced better teams at every stage leading up to the finals than they did in the finals. In 2018, the Warriors beat the Spurs, the Pelicans, and the Rockets on their way to the finals to face the Cavs. Each of these Western Conference teams being statistically better than the Cavaliers. So think to yourself, how many players and teams have been eliminated before the finals that could have made the finals if they were just in a different conference?
Good
How
point.
many NBA championships were decided in the Western Conference? This is why, although I'm a certified LeBron fanboy, I don't put as much weight into his 10 finals appearances as other fans. I have to consider the fact that during those finals runs, the East was considerably worse than the West, and if LeBron and the Cavs were in the West, they may not have even saw the finals. So just how easy was the Lakers' path to a championship this season? Quite frankly, it was historically easy. But the craziest part about all of this is that in 20 years, no one will care about the details.
Yep,
Just
exactly.
like how no one cares that 3 of Magic's 5 rings were won on easy paths. Just like how the '99 Spurs snagged a relatively easy ring during the most difficult era of the NBA. Just like how MJ's path to his first 2 rings were immensely easier than the path to his last 4. It doesn't matter because it doesn't change anything. Regardless of how you get it, a ring is still a ring. And although they aren't all built the same, they all shine just as bright.
Mate,
Hope you all enjoyed.
another
And as
banger
always,
from this
until
absolute
next
goat
time.
on YouTube. But it's true, man. I mean, look, you can look at in-depth details and you can sort of think to yourself, LeBron's had it a lot easier in the playoffs, or so-and-so has. But again, like you said, in 20 years' time, 10, 20 years' time, you're not going to care about that. You're just not. It's just one of those things that you'll see who won the rings, who's been to the most finals. But it is interesting that he said if he was in the West compared to how he was in the East for the majority of his career, he may have not been to as many finals. And that's probably a true sort of point. But say he was at a team like the Warriors, then you could sort of argue that and say, wait, well, he was at the Warriors then, and he had like 5, 6 back-to-back finals. But again, it's just where you're at like the right time. Sort of like timing is like the most important thing when it comes to sport. Like you could be at, you could be at a certain team where they've dominated for such a long time, but you join as soon as their sort of era is like finished, and a lot of their sort of stars are sort of getting older, and then you join at the wrong time, and then you go like 5-10 years without reaching the playoffs or reaching the finals, and it's just like one of those things that you just come at the right time, and you may have the sort of the finals in your favour, or you come at the wrong time and you may not have that in your favour. But I do find this stuff interesting, and I like how he just sort of makes these types of videos, man. I feel like the stat is kind of misleading. I mean, the Heat essential. I guess he means essentially reinvented themselves going into the finals in Cleveland. LeBron didn't play as hard until the playoffs, and this stat is based on regular season. Oh, is it? Okay, that's fair enough. So the stat doesn't change when you're playing in the playoffs then. That's kind of interesting. When Jimmy wants to emphasise his point, look at this graph. Hakeem is criminally underrated. The finals run was absurd. The stat only looks good on paper since Bucks have a higher SRS, but Heat have a lower SRS. We're definitely better. But then you see the Heat, how they smack the Bucks. So again, I can see why this video is... You have to take it with a pinch of salt. Like, it's one of those things that you can't take too seriously. When Jimmy's future son needs help with math homework, so look at this graph. For God's sake, but it's a good video at the end of the day. I'm here to look at these types of arguments and these types of sort of stats. And yeah, man, I mean, I'm not going to take any of this too seriously, but it's fun to see and compare to other eras. And something that I found out is the sort of the 90s and the early 2000s was when sort of the NBA was at its most competitive sort of stage. And it's crazy how many sort of, or how high the sort of stat was around that era. But I mean, that's just how sport changes, right? But again, crazy video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Until next time, like, subscribe, and peace.